Gisela was contemplating the advantage of being crushed, almost certainly to death, albeit as slowly as possible, when the messenger appeared on her homescape. She noted his presence but instructed it to wait. A sleek golden courier with winged sandals stretched out a hand impatiently, frozen in mid-stride 20 delta away. The scape was currently an expanse of yellow dunes beneath a pale blue sky, neither too dark nor too distracting. Gisela, reclining on the cool sand, was intent on a giant, scruffy triangle hovering at an incline over the dunes, each edge resembling a loose bundle of straw. The triangle was a collection of Fian diagrams, showing just a few of the many ways a particle could move between the three events in space-time. A quantum particle could not be pinned down to any one path, but it could be treated as a sum of localized components, each following a trajectory and taking part in a different set of interactions along the way. The empty space-time. Interactions with virtual particles caused each component phase to rotate constantly, like the hand of a clock. But the time measurement by any kind of clock traveling between two events in flat space-time was greatest when the route taken was a straight line. Any detours caused time dilation, shortening the trip, and so a plot of phase shift versus detour size also reached its peak for a straight line. Since the peak was smooth and flat, a group of nearly straight paths clustered around it, and all its similar phase shifts, and each of these paths allowed many more components to arrive in phase with each other, reinforcing each other, in any equivalent group of the slopes. 3 straight lines, glowing red through the center of each bundle of straw, illustrated the result. The classical paths, the paths of highest probability, they were all straight lines. In the presence of matter, all the same processes became slightly skewed, and Gisela added a couple of nanograms of lead to the model, a few trillion atoms, and their world lines running vertically through the center of the triangle, sprouting their thickest of virtual particle atoms, were neutral in charge and color. But their individual electrons and quarks still scattered virtual photons and gluons. Every kind of matter interfered with some part of the virtual swarm, and the initial disturbance spread out through space-time by scattering virtual particles itself, rapidly obliterating any difference between the effects of a ton of rock or a ton of neutrinos, growing weaker with distance according to a roughly inverse square law. With the rain of virtual particles, and the phase of shifts they created, varying from place to place, the paths of highest probability ceased obeying the geometry of flat space-time. The luminous red triangle of most probable trajectories was now visibly curved. The key idea dated back to Sakharov. Gravity was nothing but the residue of the imperfect cancellation of other forces. Squeeze the quantum vacuum hard enough and Einstein's equations just fell out. But since Einstein, every theory of gravity was also a theory of time. Relativity demanded that a free-falling particle rotating phase agree with every other clock that traveled the same path. And once gravitational time dilation was linked to changes in virtual particle density, every measure of time, from half-life of a radiotope's decay to the vibrational modes of a silver quartz, they all changed and could be reinterpreted as a count of interactions with virtual particles. It was this line of reasoning that led Kumar, a century after Sakharov, building on work of Penrose and Smolin and Ravelli, to devise a model of space-time as a quantum sum of every possible network of particle world lines. The classical time arising from the number of intersections along a given strand of the net. And this model had been unqualified, but as a success, surviving theoretical scrutiny and experimental tests for centuries. But it has never been validated, the smallest length scale, accessible only at absurdly high energies, and it made no attempt to explain the basic structure of the nets, or the rules that govern them. Gisela wanted to know where those details came from. She wanted to understand the universe at its deepest level, to touch the beauty and simplicity that lay behind it all. That was why she was taking the Planck dive. The messenger caught her eye again. It was radiating tags indicating that it represented Carton's Major, non-sentient software that dealt with the maintenance of good relations with other policies, observing formal niceties and smoothing away minor points of conflict in those cases where no real citizen-to-citizen connections existed. Since Carton had been in orbit around Chandiskra, 97 light-years from Earth, for almost 3 centuries and currently even further from all the mother face-sparing people, Gisela was at a loss to imagine what urgent diplomatic task the mayor could be engaged in, let alone why it would consult her. She sent the message in an activation tag, deferring the scape's aesthetic of continuity. It sprinted across the dunes, coming to a halt in front of her in a cloud of fine dust. We're in the process of receiving 2 visitors from Earth. Earth? Which polis? Athena. The first one has just arrived. The second will be in transit for 90 minutes. Gisela had never heard of Athena, but 90 minutes per person sounded ominous. Everything meaningful about an individual citizen could be packed into less than an exabyte and sent as a gamma ray burst a few milliseconds long. If you wanted to simulate an entire flesh or body, cell by cell, redundant viscera and all, that was harmless enough eccentricity. But looking the microscopic details of your very own small intestine 97 light-years was just being precious. What do you know about Athena in brief? It was founded in 2312, with a charter expressing the goal of regaining the lost flesher virtues. In public fora, its citizens have shown little interest in reality, other than flesher history and art forms, but they do participate in some contemporary Anthropolis cultural activities. So, why have you both come here? If they're refugees, surely they should have sought asylum a little closer to home. Mayor took her literally. They haven't adopted Carton citizenship. They've entered the polis with only visitor privileges. In their transmission preamble, they started that their purpose is coming for the Planck dive. They want to watch. They want to watch. That's what they said. They could have witnessed as much from home as any non-participant here in Carton. The dive team had been broadcasting everything: studies, schematics, simulations, technical arguments, metaphysical debates. From the moments the idea had coalesced out of little more than jokes and thought experiments, a few years after they'd gone into orbit around the black hole. But at least Gisela knew now why the mayor had picked on her. She'd volunteered to respond to any requests for information about the dive. They couldn't be answered automatically from public sources. No one seemed to have found their reports to be lacking a single worthwhile detail, though, until now. So, the first one suspended? No. She woke as soon as she arrived. They seemed even stranger than their excess baggage. If you were traveling with someone, why not delay activation until your companion caught up? Better yet, package yourself and interleave bits. But she's still in the arrival lounge? Yes. Gisela hesitated. Shouldn't I wait until the other ones are all here so I can greet them together? Mayor seemed confident on this point. Gisela wished Anthropolis protocol allowed non-sentient software to play host. She felt woefully ill-prepared for the role. But if she started consulting people, seeking advice, and looking into Athena's culture in depth, the visitors would probably have toured Carton and gone home before she was ready for them. She steeled herself, and she jumped. The last person who'd whimsically redesigned the arrival lounge and made it a wooden pier surrounded by gray windswept ocean. The first of the visitors was still standing patiently at the end of the pier, which was just as well. If it was unbound in the other direction, and walking a few kilodelta to no avail might have been a little dispiriting. Her fellow traveler, still in transit, was represented by motionless placeholders. Both icons were highly anatomically realist, clothed but clearly male and female, the unfrozen female, much younger looking. Gisella's own icon was more stylized. Whether skin or clothing, either could gain a tactile sense if she wished, was textured with diffuse reflection rules, not quite matching the optical properties of any real substance. "Welcome to Carton, I'm Gisela." And she stretched out her hand and the visitor stepped forward and shook it, though it was possible that she perceived and executed an entirely different act, cross-translated through guttural interlingua. "I'm Cordelia. This is my father. We've come all the way from Earth." She seemed dazed. Back in Athena, whatever elaborate metaphoric action they'd used to instruct the communication software to halt them, append suitable explanatory headers and checksums, then turn the whole package bit by bit into a system of modulated gamma rays. It could never have fully prepared them for the fact that in a subjective instant, they'd be stepping 97 years into the future, and 97 light years from home. "You're here to observe the dive, the Planck dive." Gisela chose to betray no hint of puzzlement. It would have been pointlessly cruel to drive home the fact that she couldn't have seen everything from Athena. Even if you fetishized real-time data over light-speed transmissions, it could hardly be worth sipping 194 years out of sync with your fellow citizens. And Cordelia nodded slightly and glanced at the statue beside her. "It's for my father, really." "Meaning what? It was all his idea?" Gisela smiled, hoping for clarification, but none was forthcoming. She'd been wondering why a Prospero had named his daughter Cordelia, but now it struck her as only prudent. If you've had to succumb to a Shakespearean name, put anyone from the same play together in one family. "Would you like to look around while you're waiting for him?" Cordelia stared at her feet as if the question was profoundly embarrassing. "It's up to you. I have no idea what constitutes the polite treatment of half-delivered relatives." It was unlikely that Cordelia did either. Citizens of Athena clearly didn't make a habit of crossing interstellar distances, and the connection on Earth all had so much bandwidth that the issue would never arise. "But if it was me in transit, I wouldn't mind at all." "Could I see the black hole, please?" "Of course." It was 6 billion years old and had long ago swept the region clean of gas and dust. It certainly left the imprint of its presence on the ordinary starlight around it. "I'll give you the short tour and we'll be back long before your father's awake." Gisela examined the bearded icon with his gaze fixed on the horizon and his arms at his sides. He appeared to be on the verge of bursting into a song. "Assume he's not running on partial data already. I could have sworn I saw those eyes move." "That's not how we packaged." "Then he'll be none the wiser. Follow me." They stood on a circular platform in empty space. Gisela had inflected the scape's address to give the platform artificial gravity, a uniform 1G regardless of their motion, and a transparent dome full of air at standard temperature and pressure. Presumably all Athena citizens were set up to ignore any escape parameters that might cause them discomfort, but it still seemed like a good idea to err on the side of caution. The platform itself was a compromise. 5 deltas wide, offering some protection from vertigo, but small enough to let its occupants see 40 degrees below horizontal. There it is, 12 solar masses, 17,000 kilometers away. It might take you a moment to spot it. It looks about the same as the new moon from Earth. She'd chosen their coordinates and velocity carefully, and as she spoke, a bright star split in two, and flared for a moment to do a small, perfect ring as it passed directly behind the hole. Apart from the gravitational lensing, of course. Is this a real view? Partly. It's based on all the images we've received so far from a whole swarm of probes, but there are still viewpoints that have never been covered, needs to be interpolated. That includes the fact we're almost certainly moving with a different velocity than any probe that passed through the same location. So, we're seeing things differently, with different Doppler shifts and aberration. Can we go closer? As close as you like.
Gisela sent control tags to the platform, and they spiraled in for a while. Looked as if there'd be nothing more to see. The featureless black disk ahead of them grew steadily larger, but it clearly wasn't moving to blossom with any kind of detail. Gradually, though, a congested halo of lensed images began to form around it, and you didn't need the flash of an Einstein ring to see the light was behaving strangely.
How far are we now? 34M? 3,600 kilometers? But if you convert mass into distance in the natural way, that's 34 times the mass. It's a useful convention. If a hole has no charge of angular movement, its mass sets the scale for all geometry. And the event horizon is always at 2M light forms, circular orbits at 3M, and so on.
She conjured up a space-time map of the region outside the hole, and instructed the scape to record the platform's world line on it.
Actual distance traveled depends on the path you take, but if you think of the hole as being surrounded by spherical shells on which the tidal force is constant, something tangible you can measure on the spot, you can give them each a radius or a curvature without caring about the details of how you might travel to the center.
As the disk itself grew, the distortion around it spread faster. By 10, it was less than 60 degrees wide, but even constellations on the opposite side of the sky were visibly crowded together, as if incoming light rays were bent into more radical paths. A gravitational blue shift, uniform across the sky, was strong enough now to give the stars a savage glint, not so much icy as blue-hot, and on the map, the light cones dotted along their world line, structures like stylized conical hourglasses, made up of all the light rays passing through a given point at a given moment, were beginning to tilt toward the hole. Light cones mark the boundaries of physically possible motion. To cross your own light would be to outtrace light.
Try looking at the halo. Where did all those stars come from? Lensing lets you see the stars behind the hole, but it doesn't stop there. Light that grazes the 3M shell orbits part way around the hole, if it grazes the shell close enough.
And on the map, Gisela stretched half a dozen light rays approaching the hole.
If you look at the light that escapes from those orbits, you can see an image of the whole sky compressed into a narrow ring, and at the inner edge of that ring, there's a smaller ring, and so on, each made of light that's orbited the hole one more time. But it can't go on forever, can it? Won't diffraction effects blur the pattern eventually? Yeah, but I can't show you here. The scape doesn't run to that level of detail.
They paused at the 3M shell itself. The sky here was perfectly bisected, one hemisphere in absolute darkness, the other packed with vivid blue stars. And along the border, the halo arched over the dome like an impossibly geometrized Milky Way, Shortly after Cartan's arrival, Gisela had created an homage to Escher based on this view, tilting the half-sky with interlocking constellations. They're repeated at the edge of the sky, with the binoculars at 1000x. Then they continued towards the event horizon, oblivious to both tidal forces and the thrust they would be needed to maintain such a leisurely pace in reality. The stars were now all brightest at ultraviolet frequencies, but Gisela had arranged for her dome to filter out everything but light from the flesher visible spectrum. In case Cordelia's simulated skin took descriptions of radiation too literally, they paused again to hover, implausibly, just above the horizon, the only illumination a pinprick of heavily blue-shifted radio waves behind them.
Shall we go? How?
The speck of sky blinked out and began to expand again. Rapidly, Gisela was slowing down a millifold. In reality, they would have reached the singularity in a fraction of a millisecond.
Can we stop here? No, just hover. We're doing that already. We're moving. I've stopped. In a way, it's nothing new. If we let ourselves free fall toward the hole, we would have been moving fast enough to see a whole range of Doppler shifts superimposed on the gravitational blue shift. Yeah? And we're not. By one perfectly good definition, it's not the definition that applied outside the event horizon. Giving powerful enough engine, you can always stay fixed on a shell of constant tidal force, so it makes sense to choose it as a definition of motionless, making time on this map strictly vertical, but inside the hole. That becomes completely incompatible with experience. Your light cones tilt so far that your world line must cut through the shells, and the simplest new definition being motionless is to burrow straight through the shells, the complete opposite of trying to cling to them, to make map time strictly horizontal. She highlighted a section of their now horizontal world line. So, when the light cones tip over far enough, the definitions of space and time have to tip with them. So the inside of the black hole isn't a sphere at all, it's a spherical shell in two directions, and the blue shift, like the blue shift when the universe starts contracting, except the space is only shrinking in two directions.
That's right. And Gisela was no longer surprised by Cordelia's rapid uptake. The mystery of how she could have failed to learn everything there was to know about black holes long ago, with unfettered access to a half-decent library and rudimentary tutoring software. She would have filled the gaps in her no time. But if her father had dragged her all the way to Cartan just to witness a Planck dive, well, they were going to witness a Planck dive. For the safety of the crew, human clones were sent into the black hole. The dive hit heavy turbulence, resulting in Cordelia's father being shot from the ship. See, he didn't want to watch the dive. He wanted to be part of the dive. Now, we join the story, aboard that ship in the middle of a black hole. The audience stood in silence as Prospero began to describe the dive itself. Timon stared at the floor with a bemused smile, and Tiet wore an expression of detached boredom. Vikram kept peeking at a display behind him to see if the faint gravitational radiation emitted by the inflowing nanomachines was still conforming to his predictions. It was Sachio who finally lost control and interjected angrily. "Carton null.
some kind of ghostly image of escape, full of ghostly icons floating through the vacuum down into the hole. That's all we're doing. And Prospero seemed more startled than outraged by the interruption. It's a city of light. It's translucent. It's ethereal. The owl in Sachio's skull puffed its feathers. No photon state we could look like that. You could describe. Could never exist. And even if it could, it would never be conscious. Sachio had worked for decades on the problem of giving Cartan Null the freedom to process data without disrupting the geometry around them. And Prospero spread his arms in a conciliatory gesture. An archetypal quest narrative has to be kept simple. To burden it with technicalities would be... Sachio inclined his head briefly, fingertips to forehead, downloading information from the Polis library. Do you have any idea what archetypal narratives are? Messages from gods. Depths of the soul, who can say? They encode the most profound and mysterious. They're the product of a few chance attractors in flesh or neurophysiology. Whenever a more complex or subtle story was disseminated through an oral culture, it would eventually degenerate into an archetypal narrative. Once writing was invented, they only ever were created deliberately by fleshers who failed to understand what they were. If all of antiquity's greatest statues had been dropped into a glacier, they would have been reduced to a predictable spectrum of spherical pebbles by now. And that does not make the pebble the pinnacle of the art form. What you've created is not only devoid of truth, it's devoid of aesthetic merit. Prospero was stunned. He looked around the room expectantly, as if waiting for someone to speak up in defense of the ballad. No one made a sound. That was it. The end of diplomacy. And Gisela spoke privately to Cordelia, whispering urgently, "Stay in Cartan. No one can force you to leave." And Cordelia turned to her with an expression of open astonishment. "But I thought..." She fell silent, reassessing something, hiding her surprise. "I thought I can't stay." "Why not? What's there to stop you? You can't stay buried in Athena." Prospero was muttering in disbelief now. Ingratitude. Base ingratitude. Cordelia regarded him with forlorn affection. She faced Gisela and spoke plainly. "Athena won't last forever. Polises like that form and decay. There are too many real possibilities for people to cling to one arbitrary sanctified culture. Century after century. But he's not prepared for that transition. He doesn't even realize it's coming, and I can't abandon him to that. He's going to need someone to help him through. But I've cut 2 centuries off the waiting time. If nothing else, the trip did that." And Gisela was speechless for a moment, shamed by the strength of this child's love. And then she sent Cordelia a stream of tags. "These are the references to the best libraries on Earth. You'll get the real stuff there, not some watered-down version of Flesher physics." Prospero was shrinking the podium, descending the ground level. "Cordelia, come to me now. We're leaving these barbarians to the obscurity they deserve." For all that, she admired Cordelia's loyalty, and Gisela was still saddened by her choice. She said numbly, "If you belonged to Cartan, it should have been possible. We should have been able to find a way." But Cordelia shook her head. "No failure, no regrets. Don't worry about me. I've survived Athena so far. I think I can see it through to the end, with everything you've shown me. I've done here, it'll help. Thank you." And so, she joined her father. Prospero created a doorway, opening up onto a yellow brick road through the stars.
stepped through. Cordelia followed him. Vikram turned away from the gravitational wave trace and asked mildly, "Alright, you can own up now. Who threw in that additional exabyte?" Cordelia bounded across Carton Knoll's control scape, a long platform floating in a tunnel of color-coded Feynman diagrams, streaming through the darkness like the trails of a billion colliding, disintegrating sparks. Gisella's first instinct was to corner her and shout in her face. A brief side branch cut short before there was time for personality divergence. Hardly counted as real life and a real death. It would be a forgotten dream, nothing more to die in a black hole. That analysis didn't hold up, though. From the instant she'd become conscious, this Cordelia had been an entirely separate person. The one who'd left Athena forever. The one who'd escaped. And her extended self had invested far too much in this clone to treat it as a mistake and cut its losses. Before anything had hoped for itself, the clone knew exactly what its existence meant for the original. To betray that, even if it could never be found out, would be unthinkable.
You didn't raise her hopes, did you? I don't think so. She must know there's almost no chance of survival.
Vikram looked troubled. I might have to put your own case too strongly. She might believe the same discoveries that will be enough for her, but I'm sure they will.
She's here.
That's irreversible. There's no point agonizing about it. All we can do is give her the chance to make what she can of the experience. A horrifying thought struck Gisela.
The extra data hasn't overburdened us, has it? Ruled out access to full computational domain?
And Cordelia was compressed herself down to a far leaner program than the version she'd sent from Earth. But it was still an unexpected load. Saccio made a sound of indignation. Timon touched Gisela's arm. Cordelia had finally slowed down enough to start examining her surroundings. Primary beams, the infrastructure for all their computation, had already blue-shifted to hard gamma rays, and colliding photons were creating pairs of relativistic electrons and positrons. In addition, a range of experimental beams with shorter wavelength probed the physics of length scales 10,000 times smaller. Physics that could apply to the primary beams about as subjective hour later. Cordelia found the window with the main result from those beams. She turned and called out. Gisela felt the knot of guilt and anxiety inside her begin to unwind. Cordelia had chosen to die freely, just like the rest of them. And the fact that it had been a hard decision for her to make was no reason to assume she regretted it. Well, you're alright. I guess I was wrong. I guess she certainly tunneled out to Athena.
Yeah. So much for your theory of closed trap mimetic surfaces.
Pity it was just a metaphor, though. Why? I thought you'd be overjoyed she made it.
Well, I am. It's just a shame that it says nothing at all about our own chances of escape.
And each orbit gave them 30 minutes of subjective time, while the true lengthened time scales of Carton Knoll shrank 100-fold, and Saccio and Tiet scrutinized the functioning of the polis, checking and rechecking the integrity of the hardware as new species of particles entered the pulse train. And Timon reviewed various methods of shunting information into new modes. If the opportunity arose, Gisela struggled to bring Cordelia up to speed, and Vikram, whose main work had been the nanomachines, he helped her. The shortest wavelength beams were still recapitulating the results of old particle accelerator experiments, and the three of them pored over the data together, and Gisela summarized as best she could.
Change, and the other quantum numbers generate a kind of angle between world lines and the networks, just like spin does. But in this case, They act like angles in 5-dimensional space. At low energies, what you see are 3 separate subspaces: electromagnetism and the weak and strong forces.
Why?
An accident in the early universe with the Higgs boson. Let me draw a picture.
There was no time to go into all the subtleties of particle physics. Many of the issues that were crucial outside were becoming academic for Carton Null anyway. Broken symmetries were being restored as they spoke, with increasing kinetic energy diluting differences in rest mass and insignificance. The polis was rapidly mutating into a hybrid of every possible particle type. What governed their future world would not be the theory of any one force, but the nature of quantum mechanics itself. What lies beyond the frequency and wavelength of a particle? In its own reference frame, an electron's phase rotates at a constant rate, about once every 10 to the minus 20 seconds. And if it's moving, we see that rate slowed down by time dilation. But that's not the whole picture. The spacing, the original wave, is only reproduced by components with just the right velocity. They trace out identical copies of the wave, at later times, all nearly superimposed. Components with the wrong velocity scramble the phase, so their copies, they all cancel out. In curved space-time, the whole process becomes distorted. But given the right symmetries, the shape of the waves can be preserved while the wavelength shrinks and the frequency rises. Vikram wrapped the diagram to demonstrate. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our own situation. Okay. So why does that have to break down? Why can't we just keep being blue shifted? All phase shifts ultimately come from interactions. Intersections of one world line with another. In this Kumar model, every network of world lines is a finite weave. At each intersection, there's a tiny phase shift that makes time jump by about 10 to the minus 40 seconds. And it's meaningless to talk about either a smaller phase shift or a shorter time scale. So if you try to blue shift a wave indefinitely, eventually you reach a point where the whole system no longer has the resolution to keep reproducing it. And as the wave packet spiraled in, it began to take on a smeared, jagged approximation of its former shape. Then it disintegrated into unrecognizable noise. Cordelia examined the diagram carefully, tracing individual components through the final stages of the process. Finally, she said, "How long before we see evidence of this, assuming the model's correct?" Vikram didn't reply. He seemed to be having second thoughts about the wisdom of the whole demonstration. In about 2 hours, we should be able to detect quantized phase in the experimental beams. We'll have yet another hour or so. What do you think I'm going to do? Collapse into hysterics at the first glimmering of mortality? Vikram looked stung. Hey, be fair. We've only known you 3 days. We don't know what to expect. No. Cordelia gazed up at the stylized image of the beam that encoded them, swarming now with everything from photons to the heaviest mesons. But I'm not going to run. I'm not going to ruin the dive for you. If I'd wanted to brood about death, I would have stayed home and read bad Flesher poetry, Baudelaire, but I'm here for the physics. Everyone gathered around the single window at the moment of truth. The data displayed came from what was essentially a two-slit interface experiment, complicated by the need to perform it without anything resembling solid matter. sinusoidal pattern showed the numbers of particles detected across a region where an electron beam recombined with itself after traveling 2 different paths. Since there was only a finite number of detection sites, and each count had been an integer, the pattern was already quantized. But the analysis software took this into account, and the numbers were large enough for the image to appear smooth. At a certain wavelength, any genuine Planck scale effect would rise above these artifacts, and once they appeared, they'd only grow stronger. The software said it found something. First, it was so subtle that Gisela had to take the program's word for it. Then the tiny steps visibly broadened from 2 horizontal pixels to 3, sets of 3, adjacent detection sites which moments ago had been registered different particle counts, were now returning identical results. And the whole apparatus had shrunk to the point where the electrons couldn't tell if the path links involved were different. Gisela felt a rush of pure delight, and an aftertaste of fear. Vikram and Tiet cried out simultaneously, moments before analysis software satisfied itself with rigorous statistics. Vikram repeated softly, "That's wrong. That's wrong. This is not an agreement with the Kumar model. They're structured across the wave." Silence descended, and Gisela gazed at the pattern and struggled to concentrate. Elated they'd found something unexpected, terrified that they might fail to make sense of it. Why wouldn't the phase shift come in equal units? This cycle pattern was a violation of symmetry, allowing you to pick the phase with the smallest quantum step as a kind of fixed reference point. An idea that quantum mechanics had always declared to be as meaningless as singling out one direction in empty space. But the rotational symmetry of space wasn't perfect. In small enough networks, the usual guarantee that all directions would look the same no longer held up. What was the answer? The angles the 2 beams had that reached the detector were themselves quantized, and that effect was superimposed on the phase. No, the scale was all wrong. The experiment was still taking place over too large a region. World lines crossing between the nets. That what creates phase. One window showed a simulation of the interference pattern, a perfect fit to the data, and Gisela felt a stab of jealousy. She'd been so close. She could have been first. Then she began to examine. This was elegant. This was beautiful. This was right. It didn't matter who discovered it. Cordelia looked dazed, left behind. Vikram ducked out from the clutter he created, leaving the rest of them to try to find something to make sense of. He took Cordelia's hand and they waltzed across the scape together. They're created the same way as every other relationship. Common links to a larger network. It's like spin. If the networks have created directions in space, that makes 2 particles, spin particles. And when they combine, they simply add together. And if they're anti-parallel in opposite directions, they cancel. Phase is always the same, but it acts like an angle in 2 dimensions, and it works with every quantum number together. Spin, charge, color, everything. If 2 components are perfectly out of phase, they vanish. And Gisela watched as Cordelia reached into the layered diagram, followed the paths of 2 components, and began to understand. They hadn't discovered any deeper structure to the individual quantum numbers as they hoped they might, but they learnt that a single vast network of world lines could account for everything the universe built for those indivisible threads. Was this enough? Her original struggling for sanity back in Athena might take comfort from the hope that the Dive clone had witnessed a breakthrough.
Gisela felt a pang of doubt herself. But the whole universe faced the same fate, and time was quantized. There was no prospect of infinite computation before the big crunch. If everything was ended, it was a void. The dive merely spared them the prolonged false hope of immortality. And if every moment stood alone, complete in and of itself, then nothing could rob them of their happiness. The truth, of course, lay somewhere in between. Small networks, huh? Now that you know precisely what phase is, and how it determines probabilities, is there any way we could use the experimental beams to manipulate the probabilities for geometry ahead of us? Twist back the light cones just enough to keep us skirting the Planck region, spiral back up around the singularity for a few billion years. Vikram looked stunned for a moment. Then he began launching software. No, it's not possible. Cordelia smiled. That's alright, I was just curious.